Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world before clocks measured time, before screens illuminated faces, before the rush of modern life stole the sacred stillness of night. Imagine a world where darkness was not feared, but welcome, where the setting sun signaled not an end, but a beginning, where stories were not entertainment, but medicine for weary souls. In that ancient world, our ancestors understood something we have nearly forgot, that the human spirit requires more than food and shelter to survive. It requires tales that transport, comfort, and heal. Long before sleeping pills and meditation apps, long before science explained the mechanics of rest, there existed an art as old as language itself, the art of the bedtime story. A gentle bridge between the waking world and the realm of dreams. These were not mere children's tales, though children treasured them dearly. These were profound vessels of wisdom, comfort, and magic, passed from generation to generation like precious heirlooms, each telling polishing the words until they gleamed with a luster that could soothe even the most troubled heart. Tonight, we embark on a journey through the mists of time to discover the entire story of these ancient tales, the cozy narratives that have guided millions into peaceful sleep across thousands of years. Stories that still whisper to us today, if only we pause long enough to listen. The story of the bedtime tale begins not in any palace or temple, but around the most humble and universal of human gathering places, the fire. Tens of thousands of years ago, when our ancestors first learned to tame flame, they discovered more than a source of warmth and protection. They discovered a focal point for community, a circle of light that transformed a group of fearful individuals into something greater, a tribe bound by shared experience and collective memory. As darkness fell across the prehistoric landscape and the sounds of predators echoed through the night, early humans huddled close to their fires. Children pressed against parents, elders seated in positions of honor. The day's hunt was finished, the evening meal consumed, and now came the hours that separated humans from all other creatures on Earth, the hours of storytelling. These first storytellers were not professionals or entertainers in any formal sense. They were the wise ones, the memory keepers, the individuals who had lived long enough to accumulate experiences worth sharing. They spoke of the world beyond the firelight, of the spirits that inhabited every rock and river, of the great beasts that roamed the earth, and of the ancestors who had come before. Their words served multiple purposes at once. They educated the young about survival. They preserved the history of the tribe. They explained the mysterious workings of nature, and perhaps most importantly, they transformed the terrifying unknown darkness into something comprehensible, even beautiful. A child who might have lain awake trembling at every sound could instead drift peacefully into sleep while imagining the night as a vast blanket woven by gentle sky spirits, dotted with the campfires of ancestors watching over them from above.
The rhythm of these early stories was not accidental. The storytellers instinctively understood something that modern sleep scientists would later confirm: that repetition, gentle pacing, and soothing vocal tones could alter human consciousness, guiding listeners from alertness into relaxation and finally into sleep. The tales often featured recurring phrases like waves lapping against a shore, creating a hypnotic pattern that the mind could follow down into dreams. Animals in these stories moved slowly, spoke softly, and almost always found safe places to rest by the story's end. The world described was one where problems, though real, were always solvable, where kindness was rewarded, where the small and weak could triumph through cleverness and courage. and where every frightening journey eventually led back home. As generations passed, certain stories proved more effective than others at bringing peace to restless minds. These special tales were remembered, refined, and passed down with particular care. They became part of the tribe's most valuable inheritance, as important as knowledge of which plants could heal and which could harm. Grandmothers whispered them to grandchildren. Fathers shared them with sons and daughters, and the stories evolved, incorporating new details while maintaining their essential soothing quality. They were not written down because writing did not yet exist, but they were preserved with remarkable accuracy through the dedicated memory of generations of tellers who understood that these tales were not merely entertainment, but essential tools for human well-being. When humanity began building its first great civilizations along the fertile river valleys of the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus and the Yellow River, the bedtime story evolved from oral tradition into something more structured and sacred. The ancient Egyptians, who left us detailed records of their beliefs and practices, understood sleep not as a mere biological necessity, but as a sacred journey into the realm of the gods. Each night, they believed, the soul temporarily left the body to travel through the underworld, encountering spirits and divine beings before returning at dawn. This belief made the transition into sleep a moment of profound spiritual significance, one that required proper preparation and protection. Egyptian parents and priests developed elaborate bedtime rituals that combined prayer, storytelling, and magic. Children learned stories of the sun god Ra's nightly voyage through the underworld, battling the serpent of chaos to ensure the dawn would come again. These tales served a dual purpose. They explained the cycle of day and night in terms a child could understand, and they provided reassurance that even in darkness, divine forces were working to bring back the light. The stories were often accompanied by gentle songs and the soft light of oil lamps that would be dimmed gradually as the tale progressed, mimicking the setting sun and training the body's natural rhythms. The most cherished tales featured protective deities like Bes, the dwarf god who watched over sleeping children, driving away nightmares and evil spirits with his fierce but ultimately benevolent presence.
In ancient Mesopotamia, the world's first urban civilization developed its own rich tradition of sleep stories, many preserved on clay tablets that have survived millennia. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though known today as a heroic adventure, was often recounted at bedtime in softer, gentler versions that emphasized themes of friendship, the search for meaning, and the acceptance of mortality. Mesopotamian storytellers understood that children needed to process the same existential questions that troubled adults, but in forms that brought comfort rather than anxiety. They created tales of gods who carefully tended to humanity, of magical gardens where the dead rested peacefully, and of brave heroes who learned that true immortality came not from living forever, but from being remembered with love. The rhythmic cadence of Sumerian and Akkadian poetry, with its repeated phrases and balanced lines, created a natural lullaby effect that guided listeners into tranquil sleep. In the Indus Valley, evidence suggests a sophisticated understanding of the connection between story, ritual, and rest. Archaeological finds reveal carefully arranged sleeping quarters, small figurines that may have served as focus points for bedtime stories, and early forms of incense whose scents were designed to promote relaxation. The stories passed down through oral tradition in this region often featured animals with human qualities, a tradition that would later influence the fables of India and spread throughout Asia. These animal tales were particularly effective as bedtime stories because they maintained emotional distance through the use of animal characters while still conveying important emotional and moral lessons. A child could process feelings of fear, anger, or sadness by identifying with a clever rabbit or a patient turtle,
gaining insight and comfort without the intensity of human drama. As civilizations grew and cultures mingled through trade and migration, bedtime stories became more diverse and sophisticated, drawing from multiple traditions to create new forms. The fairy tale, as we know it today, emerged from this rich cross-pollination of storytelling traditions. These were not the sanitized versions that would later appear in children's books, but raw, powerful narratives that acknowledged the darkness of the world while always pointing toward hope and resolution. European folk tales, collected from peasant traditions spanning centuries, carried within them the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who had faced hardship, loss, and fear, yet found ways to continue, to hope, and to sleep peacefully despite everything. The rhythmic cadence of classic fairy tales is perfectly designed for bedtime telling, though this is rarely acknowledged in modern analysis. These stories begin in the familiar world, venture into dangerous or magical territories, reach a climax of tension, and then resolve into safety and restoration. This narrative arc mirrors the psychological journey from wakefulness into sleep, from the known world of consciousness into the strange landscape of dreams, and finally into the deep rest of unconsciousness. A child listening to such a tale learns that it is safe to let go of the waking world, to enter strange territories of imagination and dream, because the story promises that resolution and return are inevitable. The hero always finds their way home. The princess always awakens, the spell is always broken, and morning always comes. The finest bedtime storytellers of the folk tradition understood the power of voice and pacing in ways that modern readers of printed tales often miss. They knew when to slow their speech, letting long pauses stretch between sentences as the story approached its conclusion. They knew how to modulate their voice from exciting whispers during moments of tension to warm, gentle tones during resolution. They knew that the final words of a bedtime story should be spoken so softly that children had to strain to hear them, drawing them deeper into stillness, often drifting off before the actual end. The classic closing formula, "and they lived happily ever after," was not just a narrative convention, but a carefully crafted spell, a repeated phrase that signaled to generations of listeners that the story was complete, that all was well, and that it was now safe to sleep. Different cultures developed their own distinctive styles of bedtime tales, each reflecting their unique understanding of what brought peace to the human heart. Celtic storytellers specialized in tales where the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of fairy was thin and permeable, teaching that magic existed alongside everyday life, that wonders could be found in any meadow or forest, and that respect for the unseen world brought protection and blessing. These stories often featured characters who slipped between worlds as easily as one slips from waking into dreaming, making them ideal preparations for sleep. Norse and Germanic traditions contributed tales of clever heroes who survived through wit rather than strength, stories perfect for reassuring children that intelligence and resourcefulness mattered more than size or power. Slavic folk tales often featured the hearth and home as sacred spaces of safety, with household spirits who protected sleeping families, creating narratives that transformed the child's own bedroom into a place of magic and security. While European folk traditions were developing their distinctive style of bedtime tale, the ancient civilizations of Asia were crafting their own profound approaches to the art of peaceful sleep through story. In China, the practice of bedtime storytelling was elevated to a sophisticated art form, integrated with principles of harmony, balance, and natural rhythm drawn from Taoist and Confucian philosophy. Chinese bedtime tales often featured landscapes of mountains and rivers, gardens and pavilions, where human dramas unfolded at a pace as gentle and inevitable as the changing seasons. The language used in these stories was deliberately chosen for its musical quality, with characters selected not just for meaning, but for the soothing sounds they made when spoken aloud. Grandparents would recite classical poetry to grandchildren, tales of moon goddesses and jade rabbits, of scholars who found wisdom in nature, of immortals who lived in harmony with the cosmic order. The Chinese understood that the content of bedtime stories could influence the quality and nature of dreams, a belief that led to careful curation of tales deemed appropriate for evening telling. Stories of conflict were permissible, but always resolved peacefully, demonstrating the Confucian ideal that proper conduct and wisdom could harmonize even the most difficult situations. Many tales featured characters who achieved their goals not through struggle, but through patience, observation, and alignment with natural principle. A famous cycle of stories told of various animals and how each found their perfect sleeping place. The crane among the reeds, the tiger in a mountain cave, the fish in the depths of a pond, each creature teaching children that there was a right and natural place for every being to rest. These tales subtly communicated that the child's own bed was their perfect resting place, ordained by the natural order of things.
In Japan, the tradition of bedtime stories became intertwined with aesthetic principles of simplicity, suggestion, and awareness of transience. Japanese tales told before sleep often had an almost dreamlike quality themselves, with events flowing into one another without sharp transitions, much like the hypnagogic state between waking and sleeping. The famous stories of the Heike clan, though containing historical battles, were recounted at bedtime in versions that emphasized the beauty of cherry blossoms, the sound of a flute across water, the elegance of a perfectly composed poem. These stories taught children to find peace in impermanence, to see beauty in fading things, and to accept the natural cycle of beginnings and endings. The Japanese biwa hoshi, blind musician storytellers, developed a chanting style specifically for evening performances that combined music and narrative in ways designed to induce deep relaxation. Their voices would rise and fall like waves, carrying listeners on currents of sound into the sea of sleep. India's contribution to the world's treasury of bedtime tales is perhaps unmatched in scope and sophistication. The Panchatantra and Jataka tales, collections of animal fables and moral stories, were explicitly designed to teach wisdom while entertaining, making them perfect vehicles for bedtime instruction. These stories operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Children enjoyed the surface narrative of clever animals and their adventures, while absorbing deeper lessons about ethics, relationships, and the nature of reality. Indian storytelling tradition recognized that the drowsy state before sleep was actually an optimal time for learning, when the conscious mind's resistance was lowered and teachings could sink directly into deeper layers of awareness. Parents and grandparents would tell these tales in a rhythmic, almost hypnotic manner, often while gently stroking a child's head or back, combining narrative, rhythm, and physical comfort into a powerful sleep-inducing ritual. As Europe entered the Middle Ages, bedtime storytelling took on new dimensions, influenced by Christianity and the structure of monastic life. The medieval understanding of sleep was colored by religious belief. Night was when demons were most active, when the soul was vulnerable, and when proper prayers and stories could provide protection. Yet within this framework of anxiety, medieval storytellers created some of the most comforting bedtime narratives in Western tradition. Stories of guardian angels became central to bedtime ritual, with children taught that an invisible protector watched over them while they slept,
fighting off any evil that might threaten. These tales transformed the darkness from a place of danger into a stage where divine forces acted on behalf of the innocent and faithful. The lives of saints provided endless material for medieval bedtime stories, though the versions told to children at night differed significantly from the more gruesome accounts preserved in formal hagiography. Evening versions of saint stories emphasized miraculous protections, divine interventions that saved the faithful from harm, and the peace that came to those who trusted in higher powers. Saint Christopher carrying the Christ child across the river, Saint Francis speaking with animals, Saint Nicholas secretly delivering gifts to the poor. These stories reassured children that kindness and faith created an invisible armor that would keep them safe through the night. The repetitive structure of many saint tales, with their formulaic openings and closings, and their recurring miracles, created the same hypnotic effect as the older folk tales, guiding young listeners into sleep even as they absorbed religious teaching.
Monastic communities, with their regulated schedules of sleep and waking, developed their own traditions around the transition to rest. Monks would recite specific psalms before retiring, prayers whose poetic language and rhythmic structure functioned as both spiritual practice and sleep preparation. The practice of lectio divina, meditative reading of sacred texts, was often performed in the evening, creating a contemplative state that naturally led into peaceful sleep. These monastic practices influenced the broader culture, and educated families began adopting modified versions of nighttime reading and prayer. The Book of Hours, popular among the medieval aristocracy, often included specific prayers and short devotional readings designated for different times of day, including elaborate bedtime offices designed to calm the mind and prepare the soul for sleep's nightly journey. The medieval period also saw the flourishing of the romance tradition, epic tales of knights and quests that seem at first glance unsuitable for bedtime. Yet these stories were often structured in short episodes with natural stopping points that allowed a storyteller to end each night's recitation at a moment of resolution while maintaining interest for future nights. The serial nature of romance tales meant that bedtime storytelling became an ongoing tradition, something children looked forward to night after night, creating positive associations with the bedtime ritual itself. The best storytellers knew how to select which episodes to tell at bedtime. Not the violent battles, but the moments of rest between adventures, the scenes of feasting in great halls, the descriptions of beautiful ladies in garden bowers, the wise counsel of hermits in forest clearings. These peaceful interludes within larger adventure narratives provided the soothing content needed for sleep, while satisfying children's appetite for stories of heroism and wonder. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century revolutionized human communication, and bedtime storytelling was no exception. For the first time in history, stories could be preserved in identical form across thousands of copies, standardized and distributed far beyond the reach of any individual. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century revolutionized human communication, and bedtime storytelling was no exception. For the first time in history, stories could be preserved in identical form across thousands of copies, standardized and distributed far beyond the reach of any individual storyteller's voice. This technological revolution brought both gains and losses to the art of the bedtime tale. The gain was obvious. Beautiful story collections could now be owned by families who might never have had access to skilled oral storytellers, democratizing access to the comfort and wisdom of traditional tales. The loss was subtler but significant. The living, breathing art of oral storytelling, with its infinite flexibility, its responsiveness to each individual child's needs, and its intimate connection between teller and listener, began a slow fade into the
background of cultural life. The earliest printed collections of tales were not initially designed for children or for bedtime, but were marketed to adults as entertainment and moral instruction. Boccaccio's Decameron and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales contained stories far too mature for children, yet their frame structure, in which a group of people tell stories to pass the time, reflected the ancient understanding that storytelling was a communal activity, a way to transform empty hours into meaningful shared experience. Gradually, publishers recognized a market for stories specifically designed for children, and by the 16th and 17th centuries, chapbooks and small volumes of tales were being printed specifically for young audiences. These early children's books often included bedtime as a recommended time for their reading, with prefaces encouraging parents to read aloud to children as part of the evening routine. The Renaissance period brought a renewed interest in classical mythology, and many ancient Greek and Roman tales were adapted for evening reading. Stories from Ovid's Metamorphoses, softened and simplified, introduced children to a world where transformation was constant, where humans could become trees or stars or rivers, teaching that change, though sometimes frightening, could lead to new and beautiful forms of existence. The myth of Endymion, the shepherd whom the moon goddess put into eternal sleep so she could gaze upon his beauty forever, became a popular bedtime tale. Its core message that sleep was not a little death, but a state so beautiful that even goddesses envied it. Classical tales of the Elysian fields and the islands of the blessed provided comforting images of peaceful afterlife, easing existential anxieties that might otherwise keep children awake, worrying about mortality. Italian and French fairy tale collectors of the 17th century, including Jean-Baptiste Basile and Charles Perrault, created the first literary fairy tale collections that would directly influence bedtime reading for centuries to come. Perrault's Tales of Mother Goose, published in 1797, included now classic stories like Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and Little Red Riding Hood, each carefully crafted to convey moral lessons while entertaining. Perrault understood that the best children's stories worked on multiple levels, providing excitement and wonder for young listeners while offering sophisticated symbolism and social commentary for adult readers. His versions of traditional tales were more polished and refined than the rough folk versions, with violence often softened and conclusions carefully structured to provide maximum reassurance. Sleeping Beauty, a tale literally about sleep, became perhaps the ultimate bedtime story. Its central image of a princess in peaceful slumber, awaiting awakening, a perfect metaphor for the child's own impending sleep and inevitable morning resurrection. The 18th century brought dramatic changes in European intellectual life as the Enlightenment emphasized reason, science, and progress over tradition and superstition. This philosophical shift might have seemed hostile to the fairy tale and folk tradition, with their magical thinking and their apparent defiance of natural law. Indeed, some Enlightenment thinkers did argue against teaching children fantastical stories, claiming that only realistic educational content should fill young minds. Yet the bedtime story tradition proved remarkably resilient, adapting to the new intellectual climate while maintaining its essential function of providing comfort and peace to children preparing for sleep. The conflict between reason and imagination that characterized Enlightenment discourse actually produced some of the most interesting developments in bedtime story art. One response to Enlightenment critique was the creation of explicitly educational bedtime stories that taught scientific facts, moral lessons, and practical skills while maintaining the gentle, soothing tone necessary for bedtime. Writers like Sarah Fielding and Anna Letitia Barbaud crafted stories that featured realistic child characters learning lessons about honesty, kindness, and diligence, usually from wise adult figures who rewarded good behavior and gently corrected faults. These moral tales were designed to improve children's character while lulling them to sleep, turning bedtime into an opportunity for unconscious ethical education. While these stories often strike modern readers as overly didactic, they served their dual purpose effectively. Children absorbed lessons about proper behavior, while the story's predictable structure and reassuring conclusions provided the psychological comfort needed for peaceful sleep. Yet the fairy tale tradition refused to die, even in the Age of Reason. The French salon culture of the 18th century saw a flourishing of fairy tale writing among aristocratic women, who created elaborate literary fairy tales that defended imagination and fantasy against rationalist critics. Madame d'Aulnoy, Madame de Villeneuve, and others crafted tales that insisted on the importance of wonder, beauty, and magic in human life. Their stories, though often more complex than traditional folk tales, maintained the essential elements that made tales suitable for bedtime: clear moral structures, ultimate justice, and endings that restored harmony and invited rest. D'Aulnoy's Blue Bird and Villeneuve's Beauty and the Beast became additions to the canon of beloved bedtime tales, their themes of transformation and true seeing resonating with children's developmental needs. The late 18th century saw the beginning of scholarly collection and study of folk tales, led by figures like Johann Carl August Musaeus in Germany, who published traditional German fairy tales in literary form. This was the beginning of a movement that would explode in the next century, but already represented an important recognition that fairy tales were not merely simple-minded superstition, but valuable cultural artifacts preserving ancient wisdom. Musaeus and other collectors emphasized that these stories had survived for centuries precisely because they fulfilled deep human needs, including the need for peaceful transition into sleep. Their work helped legitimize fairy tales as appropriate and valuable children's literature, ensuring that bedtime storytelling traditions would continue even in an age increasingly dominated by scientific rationality. The late 18th century saw a dramatic reversal in attitudes toward fairy tales and folk traditions, driven by the Romantic movement's celebration of emotion, nature, and national heritage. The publication of the Grimm brothers' children's and household tales, beginning in 1812, marked a watershed moment in the history of bedtime story. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm set out to collect traditional German folk tales directly from oral sources, preserving them before industrialization and modernization could erase these cultural memories forever. Though their methods and motivations have been debated by scholars, their impact on bedtime storytelling is undeniable. The Grimm's collection became one of the most influential books in Western culture, translated into dozens of languages and providing the foundation for countless bedtime readings across multiple generations. The Grimm tales were not originally intended exclusively for children or for bedtime use, and their first editions contained much material that was dark, violent, or sexually suggestive. However, with each subsequent edition, the brothers revised and softened the tales, responding to feedback from readers and gradually transforming their collection into something more suitable for family reading. This evolution reflected a broader 19th century development, the increasing definition of childhood as a separate, protected stage of life, requiring specialized literature, education, and care. The bedtime story became central to this new vision of childhood, a nightly ritual that marked the boundary between the adult world's concerns and the child's protected realm of imagination and rest. What made the Grimm tales particularly suitable for bedtime, despite their often dark content, was their deep psychological wisdom. The best of the Grimm stories addressed children's authentic fears and anxiety: fear of abandonment, fear of loss, fear of being devoured or destroyed, but always within a framework that promised resolution and restoration. Hansel and Gretel are abandoned in the forest and nearly eaten by a witch, but they triumph through cleverness and courage and return home to find that the wicked stepmother is dead and their repentant father welcomes them with joy. Little Red Riding Hood is devoured by the wolf, but in the Grimm version, a huntsman cuts open the wolf and rescues her unharmed. These stories acknowledged that the world contained real dangers, but insisted that goodness, courage, and cleverness could overcome any threat. This was precisely the message children needed to hear before sleep. Yes, dangers exist, but you have resources to face them, and ultimately, good will triumph. The Romantic period saw an explosion of fairy tale publication across Europe as other nations followed the Grimm's example in collecting and preserving their folk traditions. Norwegian fairy tales collected by Asbjornsen and Moe, Russian tales compiled by Alexander Afanasieff, English fairy tales gathered by Joseph Jacobs. All of these collections enriched the international treasury of bedtime stories, each adding distinctive national flavors while maintaining the universal structure and function of the fairy tale form. This period also saw the rise of individual literary artists who created original fairy tales that matched or exceeded the traditional ones in quality and popularity. Hans Christian Andersen in Denmark crafted tales like The Little Mermaid, The Ugly Duckling, and The Steadfast Tin Soldier that combined fairy tale structure with sophisticated literary artistry and emotional depth. Andersen's tales often ended with bittersweet notes rather than simple happy endings, teaching children that sadness and loss were part of life, but that meaning, beauty, and transcendence could emerge from suffering. The Victorian era in Britain and America marked the true golden age of children's literature and saw the bedtime story elevated to an art form of unprecedented sophistication. The Victorians, despite their reputation for strictness and propriety, were deeply sentimental about childhood and invested enormous creative energy into crafting stories specifically designed for young readers and listeners. This was the era that produced Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, The Wind in the Willows, The Jungle Book, and countless other classics that remained beloved bedtime reading more than a century later. These works succeeded as bedtime stories not despite their literary excellence, but because of it. Their authors understood that children deserved and could appreciate genuine artistry, complex characters, and beautiful language.
Lewis Carroll's Alice books, which began as stories told to entertain a real child during a boat trip, exemplified the Victorian ideal of the imaginative bedtime tale. Alice's journeys through Wonderland and behind the looking glass were structured like dreams themselves, with the logic of dream, rather than waking reality, governing events. Characters appeared and disappeared without explanation. Scenes shifted abruptly. Impossible things happened constantly, and yet there was an underlying coherence that made the stories feel inevitable rather than random. Carroll's nonsense verse and absurd conversations created a linguistic dreamscape that was soothing in its very strangeness, inviting the listener to let go of rational control and drift into the irrational realm of sleep and dreams. The fact that Alice always woke safely at the end, finding that her bizarre adventures had been dreams, provided the ultimate reassurance for children. No matter how strange the dream journey, morning and safety would return. Kenneth Graham's The Wind in the Willows offered a different but equally effective bedtime experience. His descriptions of the English countryside, the comfortable homes of his animal characters, and above all, the sense of friendship and community, created an atmosphere of profound coziness and security. The chapter titled The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, in which Rat and Mole encounter the god Pan protecting a lost baby otter, is one of the most explicitly spiritual moments in children's literature, combining pagan and Christian imagery to create
create a sense of divine care permeating the natural world. When read aloud at bedtime, Graham's prose worked like an incantation, each sentence carefully crafted for its sound as much as its meaning, creating a sonic landscape that guided children into rest. The book's celebration of home, Mole's humble underground dwelling, Rat's riverside house, even Toad's grand hall, reinforced the message that home was a place of ultimate safety, making the child's own bed a portal to the comfortable world Graham described. Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Books and Just So stories represented yet another Victorian approach to bedtime storytelling. Kipling crafted his tales with explicit awareness of the oral storytelling tradition, creating stories meant to be read aloud with rhythmic, almost hypnotic language. His Just So stories in particular, with their repetitive phrases and explanations of how various animals got their distinctive features, echoed the ancient creation myths and pourquoi tales that had lulled children to sleep for thousands of years. Kipling's most famous bedtime verse, the poem from the Jungle Book that begins, "Now ran the kite, brings home the night that Mang the bat sets free," was a perfect encapsulation of Victorian bedtime art, exotic and adventurous, yet ultimately soothing, acknowledging the wild world beyond the nursery while insisting on the protective power of love and law. Throughout all the centuries of bedtime storytelling, words were never the only vehicle for guiding children into sleep. Music and song played an equally important role, and the tradition of the lullaby is as ancient as storytelling itself. Lullabies represent perhaps the purest form of bedtime art, stripped of complex narrative and reduced to essential elements: repetitive rhythm, soothing melody, simple words or wordless sounds, and above all, the voice of a caring person, creating an acoustic cocoon of safety around a child. The word lullaby itself, in English, derives from the sounds lull and bye or bye-bye, suggesting that the song exists primarily as sound and rhythm rather than semantic content, a recognition that meaning is not always what matters most when guiding someone into sleep. Lullabies exist in every human culture, and though they vary in melody and language, they share remarkable structural similarities. Anthropologists and musicologists who have studied lullabies worldwide have found that they tend to cluster around certain tempos, generally between 60 and 80 beats per minute, which corresponds to a resting human heartbeat. This is not coincidental. The lullaby singer instinctively recreates the first sound every human heard, the steady rhythm of the mother's heartbeat in the womb, that original music that accompanied our first sleep before birth. The melodies of lullabies tend to move in small intervals, avoiding dramatic leaps that might startle or excite. The dynamic range is narrow, generally soft throughout, and the overall effect is of a sound environment that is predictable, safe, and gently repetitive. The content of lullaby lyrics varies more than their musical structure, reflecting different cultural attitudes towards sleep, childhood, and the relationship between waking and sleeping worlds. European lullabies often contain surprisingly dark content, with references to falling cradles, predatory animals, or absent fathers. Yet these potentially frightening elements are embedded in such soothing musical settings that their emotional impact is transformed. Rockabye Baby, with its image of a cradle falling from a treetop, might seem nightmarish, yet generations of children have found it comforting. Perhaps because the song implicitly promises that the singer will catch the falling baby, or perhaps because the gentle melody simply overrides the literal meaning of the words. African lullabies often celebrate the child and look forward to their future accomplishments, combining soothing with affirmation. Asian lullabies frequently invoke protective spirits or describe the beauty of the night, transforming darkness from threat into blessing. The practice of combining song with story created some of the most effective bedtime traditions. In Scottish and Irish culture, the shanachie, or storyteller, would often weave songs into their tales, using music to heighten emotion or mark transitions between episodes. In Eastern European Jewish tradition, the Yiddish lullaby often told miniature stories of biblical figures or folk heroes, turning religious education into sleep medicine. In many African American communities, the tradition of spirituals and work songs was adapted for bedtime, with songs like "All Night, All Day, Angels Watching Over Me," providing both the soothing repetition needed for sleep and the reassurance of divine protection through the night. These hybrid forms, neither pure song nor pure story, but something of both, represented the bedtime arts at their most sophisticated, using every tool available to human creativity to ease the vulnerable transition from consciousness to sleep. The 20th century brought dramatic changes to nearly every aspect of human life, and bedtime traditions were not exempt from the forces of modernization, urbanization, and technological change. The electric lighting fundamentally altered humanity's relationship with darkness, extending the productive day far into the night and disrupting sleep patterns that had remained relatively stable for millennia. Radio, television, and later computers and mobile devices created new forms of evening entertainment that competed with traditional bedtime rituals. Child psychology emerged as a professional discipline, bringing scientific scrutiny to parenting practices that had previously been governed by tradition and instinct. Yet, through all these upheavals, the bedtime story not only survived, but was validated and strengthened by research that confirmed what traditional cultures had always intuitively known: that stories told at bedtime served essential psychological and physiological functions. Sleep researchers in the mid-20th century began to unravel the mysteries of sleep itself, discovering its different stages, the importance of REM sleep for memory and emotional process, and the complex neurological and hormonal changes that occurred during the transition from waking to sleeping. This research provided scientific confirmation that bedtime routines, including storytelling, genuinely aided sleep. The studies showed that predictable bedtime rituals reduced cortisol levels, decreased the time needed to fall asleep, and improved overall sleep quality. The human body, researchers discovered, responded positively to cues that sleep was approaching, and a consistent bedtime story served as one of the most effective cues. The story signaled to the brain and body that it was time to begin the physiological processes of shutting down for the night, reducing heart rate, lowering blood pressure, and shifting brainwave patterns from the high-frequency beta waves of active consciousness toward the slower alpha and theta waves of relaxation and early sleep. Psychologists and child development specialists added their own endorsements of bedtime storytelling, but from a different angle. They recognized that bedtime stories provided essential emotional support, helping children process the experiences and feelings of their day within the safe framework of narrative. Children who heard stories of characters facing and overcoming challenges learned coping strategies and emotional resilience. Children who heard stories of different cultures and experiences developed empathy and broader perspectives. Children who heard the same beloved stories repeated night after night gained a sense of continuity and security in a changing world. The bedtime story became recognized as a crucial tool for emotional development, not merely a pleasant tradition, but an essential support for psychological health. The publishing industry of the 20th century responded to this growing recognition of the bedtime story's importance by creating an unprecedented flood of children's books explicitly marketed for bedtime reading. The picture book emerged as a dominant form, combining visual and textual storytelling in ways that made reading together a shared sensory experience. Classic bedtime picture books like Goodnight Moon, Where the Wild Things Are, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, and countless others became cultural touchstones, their images and words memorized by generations of children and parents. These books often featured sophisticated understanding of what made stories effective for bedtime. Simple but rhythmic language, repetition and pattern, a journey away from and back to safety, and resolutions that invited rest. Margaret Wise Brown's Goodnight Moon, in particular, achieved a kind of perfection in bedtime literature. Its simple ritual of saying goodnight to every object in a room, creating a meditation on letting go of the day and embracing night. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, new challenges emerged that paradoxically made the ancient practice of bedtime storytelling more important than ever. The acceleration of modern life, the omnipresence of screens and electronic media, the rising rates of anxiety and sleep disorders in both children and adults, all of these factors created what sleep researchers began calling a sleep crisis in developed nations. Studies showed that children were getting significantly less sleep than previous generations, that the quality of that sleep was poorer, and that the consequences included increased behavioral problems, learning difficulties, and health issues. Parents, themselves often sleep-deprived and overstressed, struggled to maintain consistent bedtime routine. The quiet evening hours that had once been sacrosanct family time were now often dominated by television, video games, and the perpetual connectivity of smartphones and tablets.
In response to this crisis, something remarkable happened: a conscious revival of interest in traditional bedtime practices, including storytelling, informed now by both scientific research and a growing awareness that something valuable had been lost in the rush to modernize every aspect of life. Psychologists began prescribing specific bedtime routines, including story time, as treatment for childhood sleep disorders. Pediatricians added questions about bedtime reading to well-child checkups, recognizing it as a marker of overall family health. Public health campaigns promoted reading to children as a crucial component of school readiness and literacy development, but also increasingly as a tool for emotional well-being and healthy sleep. The bedtime story, which had survived millennia on the strength of tradition alone, now gained the additional support of scientific validation and professional recommendation. Technology, often blamed for disrupting sleep, also became a tool for delivering bedtime stories in new ways. Audiobook services created extensive libraries of children's stories specifically marketed for bedtime listening. Apps appeared promising to use scientific principles to craft the perfect sleep story, with carefully controlled pacing, strategic repetition, and even binaural beats or white noise integrated into the storytelling. Some of these innovations proved genuinely helpful, making access to quality bedtime stories easier for families who lacked extensive book collections or confident storytelling skills. However, there was also growing recognition that something irreplaceable was lost when screens mediated the bedtime story experience. The research was clear that the optimal bedtime story involved direct human contact, voice to voice, and often skin to skin, with a parent or caregiver physically present, creating not just an auditory, but a multisensory experience of safety and connection. This recognition led to a cultural counter-movement emphasizing unplugged, traditional bedtime rituals. Bookstores created bedtime story sections with staff recommendations for the best sleep-inducing tales. Libraries ran programs teaching parents the art of reading aloud effectively. Parent educators emphasized that bedtime storytelling was not just about the content of the story, but about the ritual itself, the predictable routine that said to child and body alike, "This is the end of the day. This is the beginning of night. This is when we rest." Some families began reviving even older traditions, telling stories from memory rather than reading from books, creating family story cycles that included tales of grandparents and great-grandparents, transforming bedtime into a moment of intergenerational connection. These families discovered what traditional cultures had always known, that the story told in your grandmother's voice, whether from a book or from memory, became part of your identity
memory, a thread connecting you to your family's past and your culture's heritage. Recent advances in neuroscience have provided fascinating insights into exactly why stories are so effective at promoting sleep, and why the bedtime story tradition has persisted across all human cultures. Using functional MRI and other brain imaging technologies, researchers can now observe what happens in the brain during storytelling and during the transition to sleep. These studies reveal that listening to stories activates a network of brain regions involved in language processing, sensory imagination, emotional response, and social cognition, but in a particular configuration that differs from everyday alert consciousness. When we listen to a well-told story in a relaxed state, our brain enters a mode that researchers describe as absorbed attention or narrative transportation, where we are fully engaged yet also deeply relaxed, conscious yet beginning to disengage from immediate surroundings.
This state of narrative absorption turns out to be an ideal bridge to sleep. The brain regions associated with environmental monitoring and threat detection, the systems that keep us alert and ready to respond to danger, gradually quiet during story listening. Meanwhile, regions associated with imagination, memory consolidation, and emotional processing remain active, but in a calm, integrated way, rather than the fragmented, anxious way that often characterizes bedtime for those struggling with sleep. The narrative structure itself guides the brain through a process of gradual disengagement from waking concern. A story's beginning captures attention and creates interest, holding the mind's focus and preventing it from wandering into worry or planning. The middle sustains attention while allowing deeper relaxation to develop. The ending provides closure and resolution that satisfies the mind's need for completion, allowing it to finally let go fully into unconscious. Neuroscientists have also discovered that the specific content of bedtime stories matters in measurable ways. Stories featuring nature settings and slow-paced action increase activity in the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest response that counteracts stress. Stories with positive emotional content increase the release of oxytocin and endorphins, neurochemicals associated with bonding, contentment, and pain relief. Even the voice of the storyteller or reader has quantifiable effects. The familiar voice of a loved one activates reward centers in the brain and reduces amygdala activity, literally decreasing fear and anxiety at the neurological level. The rhythm and melody of speech, especially when reading poetry or rhythmically structured prose, can entrain brainwave patterns, gradually encouraging the shift from beta to alpha to theta waves that characterize the descent into sleep. Perhaps most importantly, researchers have confirmed that bedtime stories affect the content and quality of dream. The stories we hear before sleep provide material that the dreaming brain incorporates into its nightly work of memory consolidation, emotional processing, and problem solving. Children who hear stories of courage and problem solving before bed show increased confidence and creative thinking during waking hours, suggesting that the bedtime story literally reprograms the brain during sleep, strengthening neural pathways associated with positive traits and effective strategies. This is why traditional cultures were so careful about which stories were told at bedtime. They understood intuitively what science now confirms, that the last thoughts before sleep shape not just dreams, but waking consciousness, that the stories we take into sleep become part of who we are. As our understanding of bedtime stories has deepened, so has our appreciation for the remarkable diversity of approaches different cultures have developed for guiding children into peaceful sleep. While the fundamental function remains constant across cultures, using narrative to ease the transition from waking to sleeping,
the specific forms, styles, and contents vary in fascinating ways that reflect different worldviews, values, and understandings of human nature. Exploring these cultural variations not only enriches our appreciation for human creativity, but also expands the repertoire of tools available to modern parents seeking effective bedtime stories for their own children.
Indigenous Australian cultures developed bedtime traditions intimately connected to their concept of the dream time, the eternal realm where ancestral spirits created the world and where they can still be accessed through dreams and stories. Bedtime stories in these traditions often featured landscape features as characters, a particular mountain, waterhole, or rock formation, teaching children that the land itself was alive and filled with meaning. These stories did not distinguish sharply between waking and sleeping, between the physical and spiritual, between past and present, reflecting a worldview where all these boundaries were porous and interconnected. A child falling asleep to such stories learned to see sleep not as absence, but as entrance into another equally real dimension where the ancestors could be met and wisdom could be gained. In many West African cultures, the spider trickster Anansi became the hero of countless bedtime tales, his clever schemes and narrow escapes providing entertainment while teaching important lessons about intelligence, resourcefulness, and the consequences of greed or foolishness. Anansi stories, carried to the Americas through the trauma of slavery, evolved into the Brer Rabbit tales and other African American folk traditions, demonstrating how bedtime stories could preserve cultural identity and provide psychological sustenance even under the worst conditions. The humor in these trickster tales, even when told at bedtime, served an important function. It allowed children to laugh at authority and imagine the clever underdog triumphing over the powerful, providing a sense of agency and hope that eased anxieties that might otherwise have prevented sleep. Middle Eastern cultures contributed their own distinctive bedtime traditions, most famously the frame tale structure perfected in the Arabian Nights. While the complete Arabian Nights is far too adult for children, the structure of Scheherazade telling stories night after night to postpone her execution became a powerful metaphor for the life-preserving power of storytelling itself. Adapted versions for children emphasized different tales from the collection: Aladdin's Adventures, Sinbad's Voyages, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. These stories, set in a world of deserts and oases, bazaars and palaces, genies and magic carpets, expanded the imaginative horizons of European and American children once translations became widely available. Their exotic settings and dramatic action might seem unsuitable for bedtime, but like all effective bedtime tales, they featured clear moral structures, ultimate justice, and the triumph of the good and clever over the wicked and foolish, providing psychological closure that invited rest. Latin American cultures brought their own rich traditions of bedtime storytelling, often blending indigenous, African, and European elements into unique hybrid forms. La Llorona, the Weeping Woman, appears in countless versions across Latin America, her story serving as both cautionary tale and expression of profound grief. While the story seems dark for bedtime, it served an important cultural function, acknowledging real sorrows and fears while